In the late 19th century, France was still recovering from political turmoil, wars, and poverty. But while the nation tried to rebuild itself, a shadow lurked in its quiet countryside villages. It was a shadow so terrifying that farmers, shepherds, and travelers whispered about it in fear. This shadow had a name: Joseph Vacher. He would later be called the French Ripper. Joseph Vacher was no ordinary criminal. He was a man whose face itself told a story, scarred, disfigured, and unsettling. He wore a long white rabbit fur hat, carried a revolver, and wandered aimlessly from village to village. To some, he appeared to be just another poor vagabond. But in truth, he was a predator. His life began like any other. Born in 1869, Joseph was one of 15 children in a poor French farming family. He grew up in the countryside, surrounded by simple people and hard labor. But even as a boy, Joseph was different. Neighbors would recall that he was withdrawn, easily angered, and carried a cold, distant look in his eyes. His family tried to discipline him, but something darker was already taking root inside him. At the age of 25, Joseph fell in love, or at least what he believed to be love. He courted a young woman, and when she rejected him, he snapped. One morning, he pulled out a revolver, shot her 4 times, and then turned the gun on himself. Miraculously, he survived, but his face was left badly disfigured. His left cheek sagged, his smile became crooked, and his expression looked more sinister than ever before. From that day on, Joseph Vacher became a drifter, and soon a killer. He wandered through rural France, wearing his rabbit fur hat and military-style jacket. Villagers would see him walking along the countryside, sometimes talking to himself, sometimes humming quietly. Few suspected that this strange man would become one of the most feared killers in French history. Joseph's victims were the most vulnerable people in society: shepherd boys, farm girls, women walking alone, and sometimes even children. His attacks were brutal. He would approach his victims with charm or with the appearance of friendliness. Then suddenly he would strike, often strangling or stabbing them, and in many cases mutilating their bodies afterward. It was a pattern that echoed the infamous crimes of Jack the Ripper in London, and soon people began calling him the French Ripper. The terror spread across the French countryside. Imagine small villages in the 1890s, quiet fields, stone houses, shepherds tending their flocks, and then whispers would spread. Another body has been found. Panic gripped the rural communities. Women were afraid to walk alone. Parents kept their children close, and farmers carried weapons when they worked in the fields. But Joseph Vacher was clever. He never stayed in one place for long. He drifted on foot, sometimes traveling hundreds of kilometers across France. He would beg for food, sometimes find temporary work, and then disappear after a murder. This made him almost impossible to track. Authorities in one village would find a mutilated body, but by the time word spread, Vacher was already long gone, perhaps committing another crime in another province. Police records show that between 1894 and 1897, Joseph Vacher murdered at least 11 people. But some historians believe the true number could have been more than 30. His killing spree stretched across eastern and southern France, leaving behind a trail of blood and confusion. Each murder scene was a horror. Throats cut, bodies mutilated, signs of both rage and cold calculation. The investigation was complicated by the fact that rural police forces in the 1890s were poorly connected. There was no central database, no quick way to compare cases. Each murder seemed isolated, until patterns began to emerge. In 1897, Joseph Vacher made a mistake. He murdered a young farm boy in the village of Courzieu. This time, there were witnesses who had seen him in the area, dressed in his rabbit fur hat, looking suspicious. Villagers reported him to authorities. Finally, after years of drifting, Vacher was arrested. At first, he denied everything. He claimed to be insane, ranted about politics, and tried to paint himself as a misunderstood wanderer. But investigators pressed on. They tied him to multiple murders through testimony, forensic evidence of the time, and his own bizarre confessions. Eventually, Vacher admitted to at least 11 killings. His calm descriptions of the murders shocked everyone in the courtroom. The trial of Joseph Vacher became a national spectacle. Newspapers covered every detail. Some described him as a monster, while others debated whether he was truly insane. Vacher himself leaned into the insanity defense, claiming he could not control his urges. But doctors examined him and declared that while he had violent tendencies, he was not insane. He knew exactly what he was doing. In 1898, Joseph Vacher was sentenced to death. He showed little remorse. On the morning of his execution, he was calm. Crowds gathered to see the French Ripper meet his end. As the guillotine blade fell, France breathed a sigh of relief. But the memory of his crimes haunted the nation for years. Joseph Vacher's story is not just about murder. It's about fear, about how one man could terrorize an entire countryside, and about the flaws in law enforcement at the time. His crimes forced France to rethink how it investigated serial killings, and his case became one of the earliest examples of modern criminology in Europe. And so, the name Joseph Vacher lives on, not as a forgotten drifter, but as one of history's most chilling killers, the French Ripper, who walked the fields of France with his crooked smile, leaving behind silence, grief, and horror. The story of Joseph Vacher continues, not with the sensational headlines of his capture, but with the quieter, darker currents that shaped his life long before France would know him as the French Ripper. To understand the man who would terrorize villages across the countryside, one must first step back into his origins. Joseph was born in 1869 in the rural heart of France into a farming family. His childhood, by most records, was unremarkable. A quiet boy, thin, pale, with eyes that already carried a strange intensity. Those who knew him as a child often remarked that he did not quite fit in. He was withdrawn, sometimes sullen, and often wandered alone through the fields and forests that surrounded his family's home. Yet no one could have guessed that this solitary child would one day become one of the most feared figures in French criminal history. As Joseph grew older, troubling signs began to surface. He developed a fascination with cruelty, both to animals and to those weaker than himself. While such behaviors were sometimes brushed aside in rural communities as boys being boys, for Joseph, it seemed to be something deeper, more persistent, more chilling. It was as if violence simmered within him, waiting for the right moment to erupt. In his late teens, Joseph left the simplicity of farm life and joined the French military. Here, discipline was meant to shape young men into soldiers, but for Joseph, it only amplified his instability. Accounts suggest that his behavior was erratic, swinging from moments of eerie calm to sudden violent outbursts. He was not the kind of man others trusted with responsibility. Among his fellow soldiers, he was an outcast, someone they regarded with suspicion, if not outright fear. During this time, Joseph's personal life was also unraveling. He fell deeply, obsessively, in love with a young woman. For Joseph, it was not love in the ordinary sense. It was fixation, a consuming need to possess and control. When she rejected him, his fragile mental state crumbled further. Unable to accept her refusal, Joseph made a dramatic and horrifying attempt at ending his own life. He placed a revolver to his temple and pulled the trigger. But fate did not allow Joseph to die that day. Instead, the bullet disfigured him. It tore through his face, leaving his jaw twisted, his mouth drooping to one side, his features forever distorted. When he recovered, his appearance was haunting, a man whose very face reflected the inner chaos that boiled within him. The scar became his signature, a mark of his failure, his rage, and some say, the moment when his descent into true madness began. Those who encountered Joseph after this incident described him as both pitiful and terrifying. His appearance unsettled strangers, but it was his behavior that left an even deeper impression. He spoke often of God, of destiny, of strange missions he believed he had been chosen to fulfill. Some saw him as a religious fanatic, others as simply insane. But beneath the ramblings, a pattern was beginning to form. He was a man adrift, a wanderer, and one who carried a darkness that seemed to grow heavier with each passing year. After leaving the military, Joseph drifted from village to village. He never stayed in one place for long, preferring instead the isolation of the countryside. Along the way, he began to commit small acts of violence, theft, harassment, and assaults that often went unnoticed or unreported in rural France. The further he moved, the more dangerous he became, and the harder it was for authorities to connect the dots. In a time without advanced communication or national police databases, men like Joseph could vanish into the countryside with ease. It was during these wandering years that Joseph's violence escalated. He began targeting young shepherds, boys and girls who worked alone in the fields, tending to livestock, far from the safety of their homes. They were vulnerable, easy prey for a man like Joseph, who understood how to exploit their isolation. The murders were brutal, marked by stabbing, mutilation, and a kind of savagery that shocked even hardened investigators. Each time, Joseph disappeared into the vast rural landscape, leaving behind only corpses and confusion. One of his earliest known victims was a shepherd boy. Found in a field, his body bore the marks of Joseph's rage, stabbed again and again, his small frame mutilated. The village reeled in horror, but in a world where communication was slow and fragmented, it was seen as an isolated tragedy rather than the beginning of a spree. No one yet knew that a predator was moving silently from one region to another, growing bolder with every attack. As the months turned into years, the body count began to rise. Villagers spoke in whispers of a phantom killer, a man who struck without warning and vanished without trace. Rumors spread of a figure with a twisted face, a wanderer who asked for food or shelter and then disappeared just before a murder was discovered nearby. Some believed he was cursed, others that he was possessed by the devil himself. For Joseph, these years were a time of freedom. He roamed as he pleased, taking what he wanted, leaving behind death and terror. Each killing seemed to feed something within him, a hunger that never subsided. And as the bloodshed spread from one quiet hamlet to another, France slowly began to realize that it was facing something it had not seen before, a man whose crimes were not born of poverty or desperation, but of compulsion, cruelty, and a mind lost to darkness. This was the making of Joseph Vacher, the wanderer, the drifter, the face twisted not only by a bullet, but by a destiny of blood. The villagers of France were only beginning to understand what kind of terror had come to walk among them. By the mid-1890s, The French countryside was whispering with fear. Each season seemed to bring new discoveries, bodies left in fields, in woods, along lonely rural paths. For the authorities, it was a mystery they could not yet unravel. For the villagers, it was terror that crept into every corner of their daily lives. Parents warned their children not to wander too far from home. Shepherd boys and girls, once left alone in the fields from dawn until dusk, now looked over their shoulders constantly, afraid of the stranger with the scarred face. In small hamlets, the gossip grew louder. Some said he was a mad soldier, roaming since the war. Others whispered he was no man at all, but a demon in human form, punishing the people for sins they could not name. Meanwhile, Joseph Vacher continued his endless drifting. He walked from province to province, blending into the life of the road. He dressed like a beggar, sometimes like a laborer seeking work. He would ask for bread or milk, or simply a place to rest. And then, when no one suspected it, he would strike. Each attack bore the same signature: sudden, ferocious violence, a storm that left his victims with multiple stab wounds, often with their throats cut, their bodies mutilated. The rage seemed personal, almost intimate, as if Joseph were fighting something unseen inside himself, and his victims were merely vessels for that fury. Authorities, when they found the bodies, were left with more questions than answers. The killings seemed random, sometimes boys, sometimes girls, always young, always isolated. There was no clear motive, no theft of valuables, no sign of robbery. It was killing for the sake of killing. And in that, Joseph was unlike the ordinary criminals the police were used to chasing. For Joseph himself, there was a strange rhythm to these murders. After each killing, he would vanish for days, sometimes weeks, disappearing into forests, sleeping under bridges, surviving on scraps. Then, when the urge returned, he would re-emerge, seeking out another lonely field, another unsuspecting child. In his own mind, he began to see himself not as a criminal, but as an instrument of fate. He spoke to those who encountered him about God, about purity, about strange visions. His words made little sense, but his conviction was chilling. He believed he had been chosen, that he had a mission, though what that mission was, only he seemed to understand. The newspapers began to take notice. As bodies were discovered in different provinces, journalists pieced together similarities: the wounds, the rural settings, the witnesses who spoke of a scarred man wandering through the area. Articles began to circulate about a possible serial killer, though the term itself was not yet common. They called him the Mad Traveler, the Wandering Butcher, and later, the name that would stay with him forever, the French Ripper. In the villages, fear grew into paranoia. Men formed watch patrols, carrying lanterns and rifles, determined to protect their children from the phantom killer. But Joseph was always one step ahead, moving silently from one region to the next, slipping away before anyone could corner him. One of his most notorious crimes came in 1895 when he attacked a young shepherdess in the countryside. She was only 21 years old, tending her animals when Joseph approached her. The assault was frenzied and merciless, her body discovered later by villagers who had heard nothing but the cries of sheep echoing across the hills. The brutality shocked even those who had already lived in fear, and the press seized upon the story, spreading panic far beyond the immediate region. Each murder left Joseph more notorious, though he remained a phantom to the authorities. The gendarmes searched, questioned travelers, even arrested men who seemed suspicious, but none of them were Joseph. He had mastered the art of disappearance, hiding in plain sight, walking along roads used by countless other vagrants, and yet for all his cunning, Joseph was not untouchable. His wandering, his arrogance, and his compulsions would eventually draw attention in ways he could not escape. As the number of victims mounted, the authorities began to notice patterns. The same scarred face, the same strange behavior, reported again and again in different towns. Slowly, the net began to tighten, though Joseph himself did not yet realize it. For now, he continued his bloody pilgrimage across France, leaving behind villages shrouded in grief and fear. Each victim was another step on the path he believed had been laid out for him. Each death, to Joseph, was proof of his purpose. But to the people of France, he was becoming something far worse than a man. He was a legend of terror, a shadow that turned their countryside into a place of dread. The story of Joseph Vacher was no longer just about murders. It was about a nation beginning to awaken to the existence of a new kind of criminal, a predator who killed not for gain, but for the dark satisfaction only he could understand. And though they did not yet know it, the final act of Joseph's wandering was already drawing near. By 1896, whispers of the scarred wanderer had spread far beyond the villages. Entire provinces were on edge, and the French gendarmes, though scattered and often underfunded, were now under immense pressure to catch the man responsible. Each new killing brought outrage, and each failure to capture him brought shame upon the authorities. But Joseph Vacher was not an ordinary fugitive. He had learned to slip through cracks in the system, to vanish into the chaos of rural life. France was still a country of small farms, forests, and mountains. A man could walk for days and never be seen, sleeping in barns, feeding on what he could steal, blending into the faceless mass of vagrants that traveled the roads. In this world, Joseph was a shadow among shadows, yet the violence did not stop. His attacks grew more frenzied, more reckless, as if the compulsion inside him was tightening its grip. In one case, a 13-year-old shepherd boy was found lifeless in the fields, his throat cut so deeply it nearly severed his head. In another, a young woman was ambushed while gathering wood. Her body discovered later by neighbors who had seen nothing unusual until it was too late. The killings seemed endless, and with each one, Joseph's confidence grew. He began to taunt those around him, sometimes speaking openly about his violent urges, sometimes frightening strangers with strange rants about God and purity. People who encountered him later said his eyes seemed wild, his speech broken, as if he were both man and beast, torn between two worlds. The police, meanwhile, began to notice the same description, repeated over and over: the limp, the scar across his face, the soldier's jacket he sometimes wore. Witnesses described him as half-mad, unpredictable, and dangerous. For the first time, the gendarmes began to share reports across provincial borders, piecing together what local villagers had whispered for years: the murders were connected. Still, Joseph wandered on. He avoided cities, preferring the isolation of the countryside. He knew that among lonely paths and quiet fields he could find victims who were defenseless, far from help. And in those quiet places, his fury could erupt without warning. In the small town of Beaufort, a crime would finally bring him dangerously close to capture. A young shepherd girl, only 14, was discovered brutally slain. This time, villagers had noticed a stranger lurking in the area. They described a scarred man, disheveled, with strange eyes and a military bearing. The description was sent to local authorities, and for the first time, Joseph's name began to circulate in official reports. But even then, he managed to escape. He changed regions, walked for weeks and disappeared into the vast rural landscape once more. The villagers were left with fear, the police with frustration, and Joseph with the belief that he was untouchable. By now, his murders numbered well over a dozen, though no one yet knew the true total. Some bodies were never found. Some attacks went unreported, buried in silence by families who feared scandal or shame. But wherever Joseph passed, the air seemed heavier, the shadows darker. He was no longer merely a man on the road. He had become a ghost story, told in whispers by candlelight. Parents frightened their children with tales of the scarred wanderer, warning them never to stray far, never to speak to strangers. Travelers on the road quickened their pace when night fell, their ears straining for footsteps in the darkness. And yet beneath the terror, Joseph carried on as if nothing were amiss. He begged for food, offered to do odd jobs, and slept under the open sky. To some, he seemed pitiable, a broken man scarred by war and madness. To others, he was a menace, a figure whose very presence chilled the blood. But to Joseph himself, he was something else entirely. He believed he was fulfilling a destiny, guided by forces only he could feel. Still, destiny can only shield a man for so long. The walls were closing in, though Joseph did not yet see them. His arrogance was growing, his killings more frequent, his face more familiar to those who watched the roads. The end of his bloody wandering was approaching, though it would take one more act of violence, one final mistake, to bring the French Ripper into the hands of justice. The year was 1897, and Joseph Vacher had been killing for nearly 3 years. The French countryside, once a place of quiet routine, now trembled with unspoken fear. Farmers watched the roads with suspicion. Shepherds were never left alone. Travelers carried knives, sticks, anything that might serve as protection. Still, the killings did not stop. In the village of Courzieux, near Lyon, Joseph found his next victim, a young shepherd boy, alone with his flock. The child's body was discovered hours later, mutilated in the familiar way. Panic spread through the region, and once again, locals described the same stranger, a scarred man, limping slightly, with piercing eyes and ragged clothes. But this time, there was something different. Joseph had grown careless. Several witnesses saw him lingering near the fields before the attack. Others reported speaking with him as he wandered through town. Unlike before, his presence could no longer vanish into obscurity. His face, his mannerisms, his scar, they were etched in the memories of those who crossed his path. The gendarmes began piecing together his movements. Reports from neighboring provinces revealed a chilling pattern. Each place Joseph had visited was marked by sudden disappearances, brutal murders, or bodies found in the fields. For the first time, investigators realized they were not dealing with isolated crimes, but with a single predator who roamed the countryside like a shadow of death. Joseph, however, felt invincible. He mocked the authorities in his own way, bragging to strangers that he could not be caught, claiming that God himself had spared him for a divine purpose. Some who spoke with him later remembered the way he stared at them, not as a fellow man, but as something outside of humanity. Then came the village of Écully. A teenage girl, tending goats on the hillside, never returned home. Her body was discovered in the woods nearby, and once again, villagers described seeing the scarred wanderer in the area. This time, their suspicions reached the ears of local police, who now had enough consistency in their reports to issue a formal search. Joseph, perhaps sensing the growing danger, tried to move quickly through the region, but he made a fatal mistake. Near the town of Ardèche, he approached a farm, offering to work in exchange for food. His strange appearance and unsettling manner raised immediate suspicion. When a local constable was summoned, Joseph grew defensive, speaking incoherently and refusing to explain where he had come from. The authorities arrested him on suspicion of vagrancy. At first it seemed like a small matter. One more drifter detained, nothing unusual. But when investigators questioned him further, they discovered his name, Joseph Vacher. The description matched the one whispered in dozens of villages: the scar, the limp, the violent temper. As they dug deeper, Joseph began to unravel. He confessed to some crimes with shocking ease, describing details only the killer could know. Yet in the same breath, he denied others, as if his mind could not keep track of his own destruction. His words were wild, torn between pride and delusion. For the first time, the French police realized they had captured the man who had haunted their countryside for years. The predator parents warned their children about, the ghost who had walked the roads like a curse. Joseph Vacher, the French Ripper, was finally behind bars. But the story did not end with his arrest. What followed was a legal battle that would test the very boundaries of justice, medicine, and morality. Was Joseph Vacher truly insane, driven by forces beyond his control? Or was he fully aware of his crimes, hiding behind madness to escape the guillotine? The trial of Joseph Vacher would shock France and the world. The arrest of Joseph Vacher was only the beginning. News of his capture spread quickly through France, filling newspapers with lurid details. The French Ripper caught, one headline read, and families across the countryside felt a collective sigh of relief. Yet beneath the relief lay a haunting question. What would justice look like for such a man? Joseph was not silent. In custody, he shifted constantly between arrogance and madness. At times, he confessed proudly, detailing the murders with a chilling calmness, describing how he stalked his victims and how he felt compelled to kill. Other times, he claimed innocence, insisting he was guided by divine visions or plagued by uncontrollable urges. His lawyers quickly recognized a possible defense: insanity. They argued that Joseph had not been in control of his actions, that his violent behavior stemmed from deep mental illness, worsened by the bullet wound he had suffered years before, the same wound that left him scarred and disfigured. The French courts, however, were not so easily persuaded. The case of Joseph Vacher became more than a trial of one man. It became a test of science, law, and morality. Could someone commit 30 murders and still claim madness as an excuse? Or was this simply evil hiding behind a mask? Doctors were summoned to examine him. Among them was Dr. Alexandre Lacassagne, one of France's most respected criminologists. Lacassagne spent hours observing Joseph, listening to his words, watching his behavior. At first, Joseph tried to manipulate the doctors, acting out wild fits of insanity, pretending to hear voices, even growling like an animal. But Lacassagne was not convinced. He studied Joseph's background carefully: his childhood, his failed attempt to become a monk, his military service, the shooting incident that left him scarred. He analyzed Joseph's methods of killing, the patterns in his crimes, the cold calculation behind them. Slowly, a picture emerged, not of a man controlled by madness, but of a predator who used madness as a weapon. In his report, Lacassagne wrote that Joseph Vacher was not insane. He was rational, aware of his actions, and fully responsible for the horrors he had inflicted. This conclusion shocked many, for it meant that Joseph could not escape punishment through claims of mental illness. As the trial unfolded in 1898, crowds packed the courtroom. Journalists filled their pages with every detail. Joseph's twisted grin, the scar that cut across his face, the strange mixture of calm and rage in his testimony. Witnesses came forward from across France, describing their encounters with him, each adding to the weight of evidence. Joseph, realizing the walls were closing in, attempted to sway the jury. He claimed God had chosen him as an instrument of punishment, that his crimes were not his fault, but a divine mission. Yet his words failed to move the court. To most who listened, he was neither prophet nor madman, but a cold-blooded murderer. By the end of the trial, the verdict was clear. Joseph Vacher was guilty of multiple murders. The jury rejected his plea of insanity. The punishment was death. For the people of France, it was a moment of grim satisfaction. The monster who had terrorized their fields and villages would finally meet justice. But for historians, criminologists, and psychologists, the case of Joseph Vacher remained deeply unsettling. It raised eternal questions. Where does madness end and evil begin? Can science truly measure the darkness within a man's soul? As the sentence was read, Joseph stood silently, his expression unreadable. The man who had once stalked the French countryside like a phantom now awaited the guillotine. The courtroom was silent, except for the scratching of pens on paper and the occasional cough from the crowded benches. At the center of it all sat Joseph Vacher, pale, thin, and strangely calm, his dark eyes shifting from the judges to the curious crowd. For many in the room, he was no longer just a man. He was a monster, a shadow that had haunted the French countryside for years. And now, the moment had come for science to face evil. The prosecution called the most respected man of the era, Dr. Alexandre Lacassagne, the father of modern forensic medicine. He entered the courtroom with a thick stack of notes, the weight of decades of research evident in his steady, deliberate steps. For the villagers who had seen their children murdered, this man was their last hope for justice. Lacassagne began by describing the pattern of the killings. His voice was calm, precise, scientific. Each victim showed nearly identical wounds, he explained. The cuts were brutal, but deliberate. The same hand, the same method, repeated again and again. He raised photographs and sketches of the bodies, making the jury and the audience gasp. Women in the gallery clutched their shawls tighter. Some turned their faces away, unable to look. Yet Lacassagne continued, undisturbed. The killer's knowledge of anatomy, he said, is consistent, but not expert. It is the work of someone who knows how to wound, but not how to heal. This is not madness in the medical sense. It is cruelty, repeated with purpose. Defense attorneys shifted in their seats. Their argument, that Joseph was insane and therefore not responsible, was unraveling. Still, they pushed forward. They called other doctors who insisted that Joseph's behavior, his sudden outbursts, his erratic speech, his history of being rejected in love and attacked in war, all pointed to deep mental illness. Some even suggested epilepsy or dementia. But Lacassagne was ready. He produced Joseph's own writings, letters he had written in prison. In them, Joseph spoke clearly, sometimes even poetically, about his crimes. "I killed," one line read, "because it pleased me, because it relieved me. I knew it was wrong, but I could not resist." The room erupted. Murmurs spread like fire. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing tomorrow's headlines. Lacassagne paused, then delivered his most damning statement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not the handwriting of a madman. This is the cold calculation of a murderer who enjoys his work." Joseph Vacher knew what he was doing. He chose his victims. He stalked them. He killed them, and then he confessed, not out of madness, but out of arrogance. The jury leaned in. The weight of the doctor's words hung in the air. For the first time, Joseph shifted uncomfortably. He smirked, but his fingers twitched nervously on the wooden bench. As the day stretched on, more medical experts were called. Some sided with the defense, describing Joseph as psychotic, a man haunted by hallucinations. But the tide had turned. For every claim of madness, Lacassagne countered with evidence. The consistency of the killings, the choice of isolated victims, the avoidance of police patrols. These were the actions of a predator who understood risk and avoided it. By evening, the courtroom was buzzing. Farmers and villagers whispered to each other, shaking their heads. "He's no lunatic," one old man muttered. "He's the devil himself." Newspapers later reported that this single day in court, this clash between science and insanity, was the turning point of the entire trial. The people of France no longer saw Joseph Vacher as a broken soul, but as a calculating butcher, a man who hid behind claims of madness to escape the rope. And still, through it all, Joseph sat quietly, sometimes smiling, sometimes staring blankly at the floor. To many in that courtroom, his silence was more terrifying than his crimes. The courtroom in Bourg-en-Bresse was overflowing. Journalists from Paris, Lyon, and even London crowded the benches, their pencils scratching across paper as though history itself was unfolding before their eyes. For weeks, the trial had dragged on, an endless parade of witnesses, doctors, and experts. But on this day, everyone knew the end was near. Joseph Vacher sat rigid in his chair, his eyes cold, his posture strangely proud. He had listened to accusations, descriptions of his killings, and the testimony of survivors who had narrowly escaped his grasp. And yet his face remained unreadable, like a man who either did not care or believed himself untouchable. The defense rose to speak. His lawyer, visibly weary, made one final plea. "My client," he began, "is not a monster of reason. He is a man shattered by war, by illness, by rejection. His mind is not whole. Can we, as a civilized society, truly hold such a man accountable for actions born of madness?" He painted Joseph as a victim of life itself, a soldier who returned broken from service, a man plagued by hallucinations, a loner wandering through villages with no place to call home. He begged the jury to see Vacher not as evil, but as sick, a man in need of care, not punishment. For a brief moment, silence fell. The argument had weight. France had seen too many broken men return from battlefields, their minds fractured beyond repair. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Could Joseph be one of them? Then the prosecution delivered their thunder. The lead prosecutor, his voice sharp with righteous anger, rose from his seat. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, let us not be fooled by the mask of madness. Joseph Vacher is no victim. He is a predator, a wolf in human skin." He listed the victims one by one: the shepherd boys, the young women, the farm children. Each name struck the courtroom like a hammer. Do you think madness led him to choose only the isolated, only the weak, only those who could not fight back? That is not insanity. That is strategy. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Mothers in the gallery wept quietly as their children clung to their skirts. The prosecutor's voice rose louder. Madness does not hide from the gendarmes. Madness does not stalk its prey through fields and forests. Madness does not confess in letters, boasting of the pleasure it takes in killing. No, my friends, this man knew exactly what he was doing. He turned sharply, pointing at Joseph. "And he will do it again unless justice stops him here. And now. The tension was unbearable. Even the reporters stopped writing for a moment, transfixed by the weight of the words. At last, Joseph himself stood. For the first time in days, he addressed the court directly. His voice was steady, almost calm. "I am not mad," he declared. "Yes, I killed. And yes, I knew what I was doing. But do not think you are better than me. France makes killers every day. In its wars, in its prisons, in its streets. I am only the mirror of what this country truly is." The room froze. His words were venomous, shocking, almost poetic. Some in the gallery shuddered. Others muttered prayers under their breath. For the families of the dead, it felt like a final insult, a murderer lecturing the world as though he were the victim. The judges ordered silence, and the gendarmes pressed Vacher back into his chair. The trial concluded. The jury was dismissed to deliberate. Hours passed, the courthouse buzzing with restless energy. Reporters filed half-written stories, ready to update the moment a verdict was reached. Outside, crowds gathered in the square, chanting for justice, for vengeance. The people wanted blood. When the jury returned, the atmosphere was suffocating. The foreman stood. His voice was firm. "On the charge of multiple murders, guilty." The crowd erupted, cheers and sobs mixing in a storm of emotion. Some wept in relief, others shouted curses at Vacher. The gavel struck the desk, calling for order. And then the final words came, cold and absolute. Joseph Vacher is sentenced to death by guillotine. Inside the courtroom, there was a sense of release, as though a spell had been broken. Reporters rushed to telegraph offices. Villagers embraced, whispering that perhaps now their children could walk the fields without fear. But at the defense table, Joseph Vacher only smiled, a thin, chilling smile, as if the verdict had changed nothing at all. The iron gates of Bourg-en-Bresse prison closed with a heavy echo as Joseph Vacher was led back to his cell. His fate was sealed. The verdict of death by guillotine was final. France had spoken, and there would be no reprieve. For the first time in weeks, silence surrounded him. The noise of the courtroom, the cries of villagers, the scribbling of journalists, it was all gone. Now, only the damp walls of a stone cell, the creak of a wooden cot, and the faint drip of water from a leaky ceiling. Joseph sat in the corner, staring into nothing. His hands traced invisible patterns on the wall, as though he were carving memories only he could see. Prison guards noted his composure. No screaming, no pleading, just a man waiting for the inevitable. But not everyone believed his calmness. The prison chaplain visited, urging him to confess his sins before God. "Repent, my son," the priest whispered. "Ask for forgiveness. Your soul still has hope." Vacher's eyes lifted slowly, his expression unreadable. Then, with a chilling calm, he replied, "Forgiveness? I do not seek it. I am what I am." The words left the chaplain pale. Here was not a man broken by guilt, but a man resigned to his own darkness. Days passed, marked by routine. Bread and water slid through the bars each morning. Guards rotated their shifts, some avoiding his gaze, others staring in morbid curiosity. Reporters lingered outside the prison, eager for scraps of information about the French Ripper's final days. Rumors spread in the village taverns. Some claimed he was writing a secret memoir, others swore he laughed alone at night. On the eve of his execution, the warden entered his cell. The final formalities were read aloud. "At dawn, you will be taken to the guillotine." Joseph simply nodded. No protest, no plea. He asked only for one thing: a piece of paper and ink. Hours later, he handed the guard a short note. It read, "I die as I lived. different from you all. The dawn was cold. A mist clung to the cobblestone streets of Bourg-en-Bresse. By the time the church bells struck 6, a crowd had already gathered outside the prison gates. Executions were public, and the people wanted to see justice served. Farmers, mothers, even children stood shoulder to shoulder, their breath steaming in the morning air. Inside, guards shackled Vacher's hands. The executioner, clad in black, waited with his assistants. The massive wooden guillotine loomed in the square, its blade glistening with dew. As Joseph stepped into the light, the crowd erupted. Some booed, some cursed, others shouted prayers. He did not look at them. Instead, he lifted his chin and walked steadily, as though heading toward destiny, not death. At the foot of the guillotine, the priest offered a final blessing. Once again, Joseph refused. His last words were spoken loud enough for all to hear. "You call me a beast, but you will make more of me. France breeds its monsters." The crowd gasped. Mothers shielded their children's ears. Guards forced him down, strapping him to the wooden board. The blade was raised. A hush fell over the square, and then, with a single, swift strike, Joseph Vacher was no more. The crowd roared, some in relief, some in triumph. But amid the noise, a strange unease lingered. His crimes had ended, yet his chilling words remained, echoing in the minds of those who had heard them. The French Ripper was gone, but the shadow he cast would haunt France for decades. The body of Joseph Vacher lay still, while the crowd slowly dispersed from the square of Bourg-en-Bresse. Yet even as the guillotine was cleaned and the cobblestones washed, one question remained heavy in the air. Who was Joseph Vacher really? For the villagers, the answer seemed simple. He was the monster who had stalked their fields, attacked their children, and shattered their peace. His name became a whispered warning. Parents would hush their children at night. "Sleep, or Vacher will come for you." But for doctors, criminologists, and historians, his story was far more complex. The case of Joseph Vacher forced France to confront a terrifying reality. What drives a man to kill again and again? Medical experts of the time examined his brain after death. Some believed he was insane, suffering from trauma caused by a gunshot wound to the head years earlier. Others claimed he was perfectly sane, an evil man who chose his path freely. This debate split the scientific community. For the first time, terms like serial killer began to take shape in European criminology. Joseph Vacher was not just a murderer. He was a pattern, a phenomenon. French newspapers of the late 19th century turned Vacher into a dark celebrity. His photograph was printed on front pages, his crimes described in chilling detail. Writers compared him to Jack the Ripper in London. To the public, he was no longer just a man. He was a myth, the embodiment of rural terror. And yet beneath the monstrous reputation, there lingered a tragic shadow. Some described him as a broken soldier, scarred by war, rejected by society, and consumed by madness. Others dismissed this, insisting no amount of hardship excused the brutal slaughter of the innocent. In the years that followed, his story was studied in law schools, in psychiatry lectures, and in the offices of French police. His crimes helped shape modern profiling techniques, teaching investigators to look for patterns, motives, and behaviors that repeat across cases. Vacher, unknowingly, became one of the first names in the history of criminal psychology. But to the families of his victims, he was not a case study. He was the man who had taken away a daughter, a son, a brother, a sister. Their grief never became part of the headlines. Their pain lived quietly in the empty chairs at the dinner table, in the silence of fields where laughter had once echoed. Over a century later, Joseph Vacher remains both a warning and a mystery. Was he a victim of his own damaged mind, or proof of the evil men can choose? His name still appears in books on criminology, alongside Jack the Ripper and other infamous killers. The French Ripper's shadow lingers, a reminder that even in quiet villages and peaceful fields, darkness can walk among us. And though the guillotine silenced Joseph Vacher in 1898, the echoes of his crimes still whisper through history, echoes that ask us to look deeper into the minds of those who kill and to never forget the lives they destroyed.